Hello, A-level geographers. This is the first in a series of GeogPods on human case studies. So in the A-level, in human geography, we've got obviously 4 topics, and the topic we're covering today is globalization. So there are a number of case studies and examples that you can use as evidence to back up your arguments in your 12 and 20 mark questions particularly, but also in some of the 6 and 8 mark questions on your A-level as well. So just some of the basics on what case studies and examples aim to actually look at. So obviously location, where you are talking about, the impacts and the management of those impacts in a particular event. SEEP categories, so they are social, economic, environmental, and political impacts or events. And also evaluating and assessing, so where the impacts good or bad, where the response is effective or not. So they're the types of things that case studies and examples actually look for. Now, just some points to note before we start. Remember that case studies are used to prove your points and explanations, particularly in 6, 8, 12, and 20 mark exam questions. And at A-level, it is unlike GCSE in the sense that you can't just rely on one case study for an answer at A-level, especially 20 and 12 mark questions. You will need multiple case studies to draw from. And finally, this GeogPod covers the main case studies and examples that we use in lessons throughout globalization. There are other smaller examples that we have also looked at additional to this, which you can use as well. But for the benefit of time, this GeogPod only covers the main examples and case studies. So let's get started then. And the first case study you look at in globalization is an example of communications and travel development. And it's also an example of how technology has aided a company to develop. And that is Easyjet. So the low-cost European airline Easyjet is an example of travel, communication, and technology development. So I've got a couple of main points here about Easyjet for you. So it's a budget airline, and they've made tourism much more accessible by connecting world cities just outside of Europe and within Europe together. Cheap flights is its main goal, and it was one of the first airlines to take advantage of internet technology. So in 1998, it started to sell tickets for flights online. And budget airlines like this, there are other examples like Ryanair, for example, in Europe, have paved the way for better business communications. They've connected more businesses Europe-wide. They have made places more switched on in Eastern Europe, particularly. Between 1996 and 2000, its passenger numbers increased from 30,000 people in 1996 to 6 million in 2000. So you can see that rapid growth in passenger numbers there, contributing to globalization, obviously, via the movement of people and tourism. And finally, today, it has a revenue of over £4 billion annually, carrying more than 65,000 passengers, 65 million passengers a year. So it is a large business for tourism purposes mainly, but also business. And it's an example of how technology in terms of IT and internet can massively benefit a company. And that is as a result of globalization. So the next thing we looked at in globalization was 2 examples of large trading blocks, which help to accelerate globalization. So trade blocks essentially remove barriers to trade, which increases the amount of globalization taking place. And you can see on screen there, we've got a map of the main trading blocks around the world. The 3 largest trading blocks of those are NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, the European Union, and also the East Asian Community / ASEAN, the Association of the Southeast Asian Nations. We are going to look at the EU and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations now. So let's start with the EU. The EU is a single market, so it's one of the highest forms of integration you can get politically and economically. It has 28 member states, and it has 512 million population. So the EU's single market status means there is free movement of goods and capital and services and people as well. There are 26 countries out of those 28 members who are in what's called the Schengen area, and that removes further barriers to what a single market already removes. We've got a single currency in the EU, which is the euro, and that is adopted by 19 member states. And essentially, the point of the EU is that it uniformly regulates rules. Okay, so it uniformly regulates rules for labour and environmental regulations. It applies the same economic policy throughout all of the nations, such as the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, and also provides structural funds, loans, and support to nation states within the EU. And finally, the EU is basically an example of political globalization taking place. All right, so the European Parliament, for example, is an example of how more integrated states can become and work together within a single market. So that is the EU as an example of a trading bloc that accelerates globalization and actually exists because globalization exists. Now, the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations is a free trade area. So it's less integrated than the European Union. It is based solely on trade. It has 10 member countries and 625 million population. So across the 10 members, you have uniform low tariffs working towards elimination. So there are low tariffs between those 10 countries, and they're working towards eliminating all tariffs. And the common goal there is a single market, like the European Union, but that has not yet been achieved due to political differences mainly. So this group coordinates responses to political issues and try to work together to keep peace and to be weapons free in terms of nuclear weapons. And it basically aims to achieve consensus between these 10 nations on political conflict, to reduce violence, to reduce war, and to keep the peace essentially, whilst also economically prospering from free trade. So there are your two examples of trading blocs accelerating globalization. The next example we looked at in this topic was China's 1978 open door policy. And this is an example of how we can have varied attitudes towards globalization and global flows. So as we all know, China is a communist nation and was very strict on those communist rules right up to 1978. But in 1978, there was a change of leadership in government, and there was also changes in political attitude, therefore. And the new government had more liberalization rules, which meant more free market rules, and wanted to open up its economy to FDI, or foreign direct investment. So it wanted foreign companies to be able to invest more freely in China. So the government established what are called SEZs, which are special economic zones. And they are created all along the coast of China, attracting that foreign direct investment. And you can see the map on the top, on the bottom left there, bottom right, sorry, you have places such as Xiamen and Shenzhen, which are special economic zones. Exports soared when these special economic zones were created from $2 billion to $200 billion quite quickly. China joined then the World Trade Organization in 2001, and by 2006, it was receiving around $60 billion of foreign direct investment per year. So you can see how this liberalization in China from 1978 massively increased its economic power, led to economic growth and superpower status. The Chinese government also agreed to loosen some of its restrictions on minerals and mineral trade in the World Trade Organization. However, although all of this liberalization took place, China was still very restrictive on information flows. So it still today is very restrictive on Google and Facebook access. It has also tried to limit what's called cultural erosion. So there's only 34 foreign films screened each year in cinemas in China, and that's to reduce the amount of westernization and Western influence on Chinese culture. And there are also some foreign direct investment restrictions in place. For example, in 2008, Coca-Cola made an attempt to take over a Chinese company called Haiwan Juice, which was blocked by the Chinese government for fear of cultural erosion and westernization. So this case study, or sorry, example, is really just getting you to think about how governments can have different attitudes towards certain parts of globalization, how they can benefit from it, but also block some of it. So the next examples we looked at then were switched off places of the world. And the two examples, which are quite short here, were North Korea and the Sahel. So a switched off place, remember, is a place that is not connected to the rest of the world and is not really very interconnected. So it makes its own policies, it relies on its own globalization within its nation, and doesn't really benefit from global globalization. So North Korea is an autocracy or a dictatorship, remember, and that means it plays a huge role in North Korea not really being very connected to the rest of the world. It is politically and socially isolated. So it controls globalization quite heavily. For example, people in North Korea don't really have internet access or social media access. There is an intranet access, which is an internal internet server run by the North Korean dictatorship, but that doesn't have access to any internet sites outside of North Korea. There's no undersea data cables connecting to other parts of the world, and it is basically cut off from westernization. So it has a very distinct North Korean culture, which hasn't been influenced much by outside sources. The Sahel region is slightly different in the sense that it's not trying to restrict globalization, but because of its geographical position and its geographical features, it can't globalize much. So poverty is a major issue across the 12 countries of the Sahel region. There has been mismanagement of resources by governments and corruption and lack of resources, and they've all played their part in the Sahel region not really being able to fully take part in globalization. So there's also what's called shallow forms of integration. So farmers depend on each other within that region and don't really trade much outside of that region, although this is changing. And today, countries just to the south of the Sahel, like Nigeria, are rapidly growing and are the fastest growing nations of the Sahel region. And therefore, it is likely within the next 50 years that the Sahel region will develop more rapidly as these North African nations start to manage their resources better and poverty starts to decrease. So there are your two examples of switched off places. Next examples in this topic were about global production and communication networks. So we have two terms here, offshoring and outsourcing. For offshoring, we looked at China, and for outsourcing, we looked at India. Now, offshoring in China, remember, offshoring is essentially where companies move parts of their production processes, parts of their companies to countries like China. So China has gained the status of the workshop of the world. The incomes have risen, the middle classes have become bigger, economic growth has remained high, and all of this is because manufacturing has largely shifted towards China. Technology has been shared with China, which means it's been able to increase its production amounts and how efficient it is. It's also been able to increase its innovation. Cities like Shenzhen have low-cost labor with poor working conditions still, though. Exploitation has taken place, but this is improving over time. What does remain high, though, is environmental damage as a result of the global shift and offshoring. So air pollution is a major issue, and life expectancy has reduced by 5 years in those major cities like Shenzhen as a result of increased burning of fossil fuels, increased use of manufacturing, and so on. So offshoring benefits massively countries such as the UK in the sense that it means companies within the UK can actually move parts of their production process out towards cheaper areas like China and benefit from the profits of that. But it also has disadvantages for the UK in the sense that there is a loss of jobs there. Now, outsourcing, our example for that was India. And outsourcing is essentially where we get another service in another country to complete that service for us. So India, for example, has many fluent English speakers. It has a legacy of British rule as well, being part of the British Empire, and it has high broadband capacity in cities such as Bangalore. So that makes India a perfect place for outsourcing of call centers, for example, by broadband companies and telephone communication companies. Indian call centers have workers which earn good middle class wages for India, and the companies are extremely profitable. An example of that is Infosys, which is a US company, and that company, based in Bangalore now, makes $9 billion worth of profit annually. So our next section in globalization was a case study looking at Mumbai and Karachi as two cities with rapid megacity growth. So let's start with Mumbai there. So Mumbai has a population in 1970 of 10 million, which over doubles then to 22 million by 2015. That was mainly fed by rural urban migration from poorer areas such as Bihar. Urban employment has widened in skills and variety, so there is more and more people being trained and having education for this urban employment, and big brands like Hilton hotels and Starbucks and so on are now present in Mumbai, meaning that the services are tailored to the widening middle class. So more and more middle class people in Mumbai means middle class services are needed as well. There is a massive contrast in Mumbai between the wealthy and the poor, though. The wealthy people have spent more and more on housing, for example, and that's made house prices rise higher and higher, whilst poorer areas such as Dharavi in Mumbai have a 1 million population, which is a slum, and they are under great pressure. And their land space is also being taken up by new developments, which are tailored towards the middle and upper classes as well. So there's a big inequality issue and poor versus rich issue in Mumbai. Now, Karachi is the former capital city of Pakistan, as it had a 24 million population in 2015, which makes it one of the world's largest megacities behind Tokyo. Karachi is the center of finance, industry, and trade. People flock there from rural areas such as Punjab provinces. And it is increasingly a professional city in terms of job opportunities. Jobs are mainly in shipping, banking, retailing, and manufacturing. And it is also a famous university city, producing skilled graduates, particularly in media studies. So Karachi is one of those cities that in future will be extremely important for economic development within Asia. It already is quite an important city in that sense, but it is making rapid progress towards higher status. So they are two examples of megacities and how rapid growth has changed or impacted them. A major case study in this topic was about cultural changes and cultural erosion, and the effect of those changes on people and the environment. So we used three major examples to look at cultural change and cultural erosion and the impact. So let's start with the first example in this case study, and that was changing diets in Asia. And you can see the image on the bottom left there is of something you will all know well, a Big Mac. But obviously in Asia, it is also provided as a food by McDonald's and slightly tailored. So traditional Asian diets were high in vegetables and low in meat. But during the 1990s, meat consumption per capita in Asia increased from 5 kg to 50 kg every year annually. So you can see the impact of globalization there straight away, and the westernization in terms of meat being transferred into Asian diets. Fast food chains increased, Globalization has increased, and that means more meat products are available, more choice for Asian markets is there, and an increase in processed goods too, which are a Western diet style. Impacts have also been seen in the environment, such as a rise in emissions due to more manufacturing taking place and higher meat production. Agricultural demand has also risen as people demand more varied diets, and land degradation, therefore, has also taken place due to the fact that more land is needed for cattle farming as well as traditional vegetable farming. Our next short example in this case study was the indigenous people of Amazonia and how they're impacted by cultural change. So tribes are increasingly aware in the Amazon rainforest of Western culture and lifestyle. For example, clothing culture in the Amazonian tribes is actually changing, with many now wearing things like t-shirts, which they never did in the past. Increasingly also, urbanization is taking place in tribe areas. And of course, urbanization is a Western trend where more and more people move towards cities. There are more cities built and so on. And social needs are starting to triumph cultural needs. So income, healthcare, education are becoming more valuable in the Amazonian tribes compared to the traditional ideals of hunting and gathering and community spirit. So we are seeing these Western ideals trickle into the Amazonian tribes. The impact, of course, on the environment is very simply land degradation and also deforestation due to urbanization. And finally, the 2016 Rio Paralympic athletes. So cultural attitudes to disability are changing. Now, the Paralympics, remember, is disability sport, okay? Every 4 years alongside the main Olympics as well. And global media has helped turn the Paralympics into one of the world's biggest events. It's grown every single time it's happened, and there are now 159 nations of the world which take part. And all of this, particularly the media outlook on it, has enabled more traditional attitudes to change towards disabilities and Paralympians. So that is a positive impact worldwide on people's views of cultural change. So that is a roundup of your examples throughout the cultural change case study in terms of impacts on people and the environment. Our next example was extremism in Europe and attitudes towards migration and cultural mixing. So you can see a graph here on the right, which shows you migration by nationality, and we have non-EU immigrants, EU immigrants, and British people as well in terms of net migration. You can see that obviously when we look at the EU versus the non-EU migration into the UK, non-EU migration has nearly always been higher throughout history because there are simply more people to migrate to the UK. But for the 28 nations of the EU, the European Union, migration is quite high in comparison when you consider 28 nations versus the other 170 of the world. However, this is slightly changing in recent history as well. So all of this migration has led to nationalist parties in the EU, such as France's Front National, the National Front, or the British National Party in the UK, having commanded significant support over the last 20 years or so. And they oppose migration severely. Although the UK has seen race relations improve over the last 50 years, but there are still some issues. And in France, tensions have risen. So, for example, you may remember the Charlie Hebdo attack in 2015 near Paris, and that was fueled by Islamic extremism and Islamic terrorism. 25% of voters in France supported the Front National in the 2014 EU elections. And coincidentally, today in 2021, the Front National are very popular nationally and are in opinion polls set to be a very close second at the moment in France's general elections due to take place very soon. So you can see that migration plays a massive role here in extremist movements and right-wing movements in this case as well. And just a bit more on tensions and migration in the EU and how we've tried to control in the UK migration. You can see there another graph on the right-hand side, and this has emigration and immigration on it. And you can see immigration is consistently higher than emigration, which means more people coming in than leaving the UK, and therefore our population is rising. And in 2010, there was a 5-tier points-based system put in place for immigration, but that only applied to countries outside of the EU, because of course the EU has freedom of movement, and we were part of the EU at the time in the UK, and therefore we could not apply those controls on migration. And the UK government also pledged in 2010 to reduce migration into the UK to below 100,000 per year, but that target was never met and never could be met. And the reason for that was that there's fewer British citizens leaving the UK. Immigration is actually reducing and falling. The UK government has no control over migration at all from the EU because of the EU freedom of movement rules. However, this is changing because the UK left the EU in 2019. And refugees are allowed to remain in the UK when they arrive under human rights law. So any refugees that arrive to the UK from anywhere else do have the right to remain, and therefore it is difficult to control the amount of refugees that come to the UK. Now, one of the other major case studies in this topic was international tensions, and we had 2 examples here. We had the Mekong Delta in Asia, and we also have the First Nations of Canada. So the Mekong Delta then was a proposed building of dams along the Mekong Delta to manage flooding and create hydroelectric power. Now, there are a number of nations involved in this, including China, Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. We're just going to go through what the benefits or disadvantages to those nations are. So for China, China owns half of the territory of the Mekong Basin, so it would greatly benefit from damming the river and generating hydroelectric power, as it would all create economic growth. So for China, it's all a big win. For Thailand, 36% of Thailand is within the basin territory, so it's not massively linked to the Mekong Delta, but a third of it is. But Thailand would also benefit from extra water and extra electricity, and also it would benefit rural investment and rural development as well. So it is a bonus also for Thailand. Now, Vietnam will be at a disadvantage if the river is dammed. And the reason for that is because farmland area in the Delta supports 40% of Vietnam's food supply. So the Delta is extremely important for Vietnam in terms of food. Damming the Mekong will actually reduce river flow, and that will hamper water flow, which hampers growing seasons as well. And finally, Laos is at a major disadvantage to damming the river too. It is one of the world's poorest nations. 90% of the population relies on this basin for agriculture. Dams obviously reduce growing ability through river flow reduction as well. Now, another example of tensions is in First Nations Canada. Now, the First Nations are a group of 6 tribes who live in the north of Canada, and they oppose attempts by global oil companies to switch on their region. Now, you'll remember earlier we looked at switched off places. Some of rural Canada is switched off, and the attempt is by global oil companies to switch them on to make them more connected as a region and to benefit from the advantages of natural resources. Petroleum developments have already negatively impacted tribes there, with 200 million barrels of oil already been extracted, which has led to the death of some fish like trout, oil-polluted lakes, and an influx of alcohol and drugs into the area due to the wealth of some of the oil barons. And transnational companies such as Shell and ExxonMobil are now exploring the northwest of Canada for further assets and to further extract natural resources. So the tension here has been massive between the 6 tribes, the 6 tribes and the police and the oil companies within the region who are extracting the natural resources. So there are your 2 examples of international tensions, the Mekong Delta and First Nations Canada. You then had another case study looking at the winners and losers of the global shift. So this is a really brief one on China. And let's start by looking at the winners of the global shift in China. Manufacturers. Foreign direct investment has dramatically increased. Infrastructure has expanded. And high-speed rail has also expanded in China, with 250 airports now in place as well. The public also benefit in the sense in that there is reductions in poverty. Over 300 million people are now considered middle class in China, and the poverty rate is only 10% of the population today, on average. There are some losers. Environmentalists, for example, have protested about the dramatic increase in emissions and air pollution, and there's also been a degradation of farmland as well. Farmers have lost land space due to manufacturing growth. They have lost fertility of soil, so the ability to farm has become much harder, and there has been a loss of jobs and incomes as a result of that. And finally, the public also are losers in this case because of air pollution, because of water shortages leading to significant healthcare issues, and currently around 100 cities suffer from water shortages in China. That is all of the major examples and case studies from the globalization topic. Your job now is to use that information to answer your 8, 12, and 20 mark questions effectively using Peel paragraphs, making your point, explaining your point in detail, using the evidence from the case study, and linking back overall with most, somewhat, or least important, especially for 12 mark questions. The next GeogPod for A-level case studies will be on diverse places, so go over to that when you get the opportunity during your revision, and that will be slightly longer because diverse places is a topic that is all about places. Hope you found this useful, and see you in the next one.